Oh cool, it's a new Metroid. Oh, it's Metroid 5. Oh! Alright. I'm trying something new with this, the experiential review. I was gonna give a little speech about what I'm trying to do with this review, but I think it'd be better to let it speak for itself. I will say that it should be fine to watch regardless of whether you've played the game or not. I will give warnings about spoilers and things. No preamble is really needed here. Let's just get into it. Let me share my experience. The gameplay is an interesting experience right off the bat. The first thing I noticed seconds after starting was that I didn't like how the shoulder buttons were used. By default, it's set so that L is for aiming, R is for priming missiles, and ZL is for sliding. This might just be me, but I find it more natural to use the bigger triggers for the shooting related mechanics. I ended up remapping the controller just for this game, and the fact that you can do that on the Switch now is super accessible and I love it, but what I'm saying is this default control scheme felt unnatural to me regardless, and it felt so much better once I changed it. Otherwise I had a fine time with the controls, with a tiny exception. The grapple beam, a series staple, returns in this game, and to prime it you have to hold ZR, or R in my case because I remapped the controls, and then press Y to fire it. But then of course to aim it I'm holding ZL and I'm pressing the left stick in whichever direction, and once you grapple something, if you let go of Y you'll lose your grip, so by the time I'm latched onto this ceiling I'm holding 4 things, and I'm always thinking for a second, am I good to let go of any of these buttons? And the answer is generally yeah, I can let go of all of them, but the primal animal inside me thinks it's holding like 4 live grenades. I always hesitate, and that's probably just me because I can be pretty scatterbrained. I won't blame the game if it's just a me thing, but this is an experiential review for a reason. As with any Metroidvania, the core gameplay is about exploring and finding upgrades and having those upgrades accentuate your exploration. Like usual, all the major power-ups are mandatory, sequence breaks notwithstanding, and the health and ammo upgrades are optional. While the layout of the game does a good job of looking non-linear, in practice it's very streamlined. You'll go to a place, you'll get a new power-up, and then once you move beyond the power-up room you'll be deposited at an elevator or a teleporter or whatever that will just throw you to precisely where you can use that new power-up to open up the route to the next new item. This leads to 2 effects. The first effect was that I felt a bit discouraged from straying from the path laid out for me, especially because although there are plenty of places where you'll see an upgrade and think, oh, I can't grab that right now, the game also hands you a fair few of them. I'd say there might be as many as like 5 energy tanks that I collected without even needing to backtrack or leave the beaten path. But even then, there's not a wide array of options for going off track. It was a very common sight to end up in a room with 3 doors and think, I'll get to explore behind each of these and figure out where to go first, only for it to be immediately evident that 2 of them led about 5 feet before requiring an item to proceed. That's not how I remember the Monty Hall problem. The other effect of the streamlined design was that I didn't get lost. It's not a bad thing per se to prevent players from getting lost, especially if getting lost is not meant to be part of the game experience, but I wonder if it's possible to streamline things too much. The map screen is very detailed, far beyond the classic Metroidvania blocks and dots. Where the classic map gives vague indications of secrets by marking rooms with a dot, Dread's map highlights every uncollected item and what it is. It marks every door and interactable item with a label, and even if something's not marked, a specific chunk of the map will glow to indicate that there's a secret there. And you don't need to unlock any item to see that glow, by the way, it's there by default. You can drop waypoints on the map, but I can't imagine why you'd need to. But the map's detail could be called necessary because the game world would be pretty difficult to navigate without it. There's virtually no landmarks. I can look at the map and go, right, that's the room that's kind of big. Or, oh yeah, that's the room with the blocks. But there's very little by way of interesting set pieces. In fact, the word that sums up most of the world design is functional. With every new power you get, it's immediately evident what use you'll get out of it. Metroid games have always had the color-coded doors and the blocks susceptible to specific weapons, but Dread very rarely steps beyond this. Oh, I have a new weapon? Now I can break a new type of block, I can open a new color of door, and the description on the pause screen will hammer in exactly what it does, exactly what enemy type is vulnerable to it, exactly which door will open. It's not a hint, it's spelled out for you. I never spent a second questioning which power I needed to deal with any interactable object I encountered. More times than not, I didn't even really need to think about how to proceed. Insert a very funny and topical joke about David what's-his-name. You don't need to bother remembering where these objects are because the game will deposit you at the important ones and the map will identify the rest. Traditionally, you might get the grapple beam and say, cool, I remember a room that had grapple points, I'll go back there and swing over. In Dread, the grapple beam lets you open a certain kind of door and interact with a certain type of object. It has grapple points, but they feel much more incidental in this game. Another example, every Metroid game has an ice weapon, and one of the classic functions of it is to turn enemies into platforms. So you get it, and then you remember that room with the enemies that you can now go all ice climber on. In Metroid Dread, the ice weapon destroys specifically designated fire objects. It's the latest in this trend of Nintendo-published games omitting anything that doesn't have a gameplay function. Nothing's there just for framing or environmental storytelling or selling you on the setting. The world is just made of nondescript blocks, and as soon as you see one, you know how to deal with it, and whether you can deal with it, no experimenting required. Exploring in Dread is still fun, but it doesn't feel like you're exploring a breathing world, it feels like you're rattling down a checklist in a world made of toy blocks. The grapple beam and the ice missile do have other functions though. They can change your approach to action. The ice missile does still freeze enemies, and the grapple beam can be used to latch onto some surfaces, which is crucial in chase sequences. But these practical uses feel distinct from the exploratory uses. Freezing enemies doesn't help you explore. The functions are not synergistic. There's a line drawn with exploration on one side and action on the other. You would think that the multiple uses would make items feel more versatile, yet somehow it makes them feel more perfunctory. Enemies are there just to be there. They didn't really correlate with exploration or change how I felt about proceeding through the environment beyond having to either avoid them or stop and fight them. For whatever it's worth, the action was the highlight of the gameplay for me. The melee counter from Samus returns. It always made me feel cool, like a samurai or something, but there's often no two ways about combat, at least before certain upgrades. With some early game enemies, you can take them out with several individual shots or one melee counter. You're technically given options for combat, but there is a clearly delineated right and wrong way. The whole Sekiro thing is a good mechanic for forcing you to get close to enemies and cross-contaminating aggression and defense, but the prominence of it means that the way to deal with a lot of situations is just to park yourself near the enemy and wait for it to do something you can counter. The EMMI zones are where the game shines though. I love a good stealth mechanic, and the sound design, the visuals, everything is crafted to maximize tension. You play this game and you'll hear that beeping noise every time you're alone at night. These are easily some of the scariest sequences I've seen in a 2D game, and doing horror in 2D is no small feat. Before the game came out, I was a little worried that having the delineated EMMI zones might cheapen the tension, make it less scary, but I was pleasantly surprised. When it hears you, you'll find yourself scampering for a hiding place, and when it sees you, you go into a full-blown panic just trying to survive. It's exhilarating. Every time you get the Omega Cannon, the weapon that lets you defeat the EMMI, the tension still doesn't drop because it takes like 3 years to charge. Imagine Nemesis is chasing you and the only way to defeat him is to caramelize onions. If it catches you, you have a chance to counter it that's really difficult to pull off, but god does it feel good if you do. But speaking of zones, we're about to enter a spoiler zone, so if you don't want to know about gameplay related spoilers, this is your chance to jump ahead. Alright, talking about the EMMIs, the last EMMI encounter does something very interesting. By the time you get there, you have so many upgrades that getting through is a breeze. It's not even really a matter of being stealthy, you just glide through, no fear. Even if you get spotted, you can escape with fairly little effort. Then you fight Uncle Brain and get the weapon thing and come back out to take out the enemy, and an elevator whisks you to a tight, cramped little loop of hallway, and that is where you have to deal with it. It's genius. It snatches the power away from you and produces what I considered the most tense EMMI sequence in the game. Now, I called it the last EMMI. The game specifies early on that there are 7 of them. The one I just described is number 6. The first one is a write-off tutorial with no challenge, and the last one, well, without spoiling the story, it ends up getting replaced with a mini-boss fight before the sequence even begins. So there's 7, but really there's 5. Make of that what you will. On the subject of bosses, they are another high point of the game. There are 3 recurring mini-bosses, not counting EMMIs. The brains that you fight to get EMMI repellent, these assassin guys and these spear guys. You fight about 40 of each of these, but I didn't find it all that bad. The brains are the simplest, but still demand that you're alert and engaged with a non-stop flow of projectiles. The spear guys force you to keep their distance, and you get to finish them off with a very cool looking counterattack. The assassin guys were the most fun for me. They're shooting matches where you have to constantly move and react, and I found them the most challenging of the 3 recurring mini-bosses. There are 7 unique bosses, 2 of which I would call mini-bosses, leaving 5 proper boss fights. I won't talk about each of them, but they are generally fun and frantic. Like in Samus Returns, countering an attack lets you punish the boss. Timing these counters is sometimes difficult, and the animations are really exciting to watch, which makes it satisfying to pull off. With the exception of mashing the attack button though, you don't really do anything in these punish sequences. They might as well be cutscenes. That said, most of the bosses are not as heavily reliant on the counter as some areas of the game can be. I will talk about one boss though. The comeback of iconic series villain Shrek as the second boss of the game. It's everything one could ask for in modernizing a classic boss fight. It pays homage to earlier incarnations and keeps what works, while also embracing the mechanics of the new game. The really notable thing is the way he's a big, icky, feral monster, same as he's always been with the claws and the sludge, and then suddenly, Jesus! The fight also has a little Easter egg that Metroid fans will appreciate. We're out of the spoiler zone now, glad we made it through. Those of you that sequence broke, welcome back. Some may feel that Dread's emphasis on action and combat detracts from the series' sense of broody, moody isolation and, you know, whatever emotion this game is supposed to be about. And though I find the game's tendency to be of 2 minds may at times make the experience feel less cohesive, I never really felt that way about the tone. It's tense when it wants to be, it's exciting when it wants to be. That said, the tension is largely limited to the EMMI zones. It doesn't really have the pervasive foreboding atmosphere that some of the games have. Whether it's really worth it to compare a game to other entries in its series is sort of up to you though. Let's take a look at the game's power-ups. Although they were advertised before the game came out, some might consider it a spoiler, so I'll give you a timestamp just in case. All the standard beam upgrades are present: charge, wide, plasma, wave, and they threw in the diffusion beam from Other M. Okay. They all give you a bit more of an edge over enemies and let you interact with a new type of thing. Missiles also do the cumulative upgrade thing like in Fusion. Super Missile, the aforementioned Ice Missile, and then there's the Storm Missile, which is basically the Seeker Missile from Prime 2. This one changed my approach to combat a fair bit because having the ability to lock onto enemies means you can afford to move around a little more and not worry so much about your aim. It also costs a lot of ammo to use, which is an effective way to keep its use in check. It really feels like an addition to your arsenal. There's the Morph Ball, or as I like to call it, magic spell that makes your roommates say, "How does she fit in there?" I don't know, bro, but you're definitely the first person to ever ask that. It comes with the standard bomb and power bomb upgrades. The power bomb is very cool looking in this one. There's a new bomb upgrade called Cross Bomb. It's like bingo, but pious. This one's really weird. It's useful in extremely specific contexts. Every time I use it, I can only think why. It's also one of the last upgrades in the game. The Spider Magnet lets you climb specifically designated walls and ceilings. It is critical to navigating the game, but I really can't say I feel anything about it. It's basically like if you had to unlock climbing a ladder. We've already talked about the grapple beam. The Spood Beaster returns. You have to activate it by clicking the left stick while running, which always feels just a little bit off. It's the basis of the hidden items that are the absolute most complex, challenging, and exhilarating in the game, and I love that, but I didn't find myself using it much outside of where the game wanted me to. You have to manually activate it, which I wasn't thinking to do a lot of the time, and the game just doesn't have a lot of runways to use it in. The infinite space jump returns, but before that you get the spin boost, which is just a double jump. Bit odd. It also really felt like I got the space jump very shortly after the spin boost, making the spin boost even more forgettable. There is something very satisfying about how rhythmic the space jump feels. The screw attack is back and also feels very satisfying. When you have both the space jump and the screw attack, that hammers in how powerful you've gotten. It's just a shame that so few of the other power-ups also provide that feeling of development. Finally, AN abilities return from Samus comes back, but they feel totally different. In Samus Returns, if I remember right, they were necessary here and there, but for the most part they felt like these on-call power-ups that would make things easier if you chose to use them. Not too dissimilar to the invincibility power-ups in recent Mario games. In Dread, they're a much more core piece of gameplay. The scan pulse returns, because if there's one thing this game needs, it's to make progression more streamlined. The thing I liked about Super Metroid's X-ray visor is that you would have to aim it where you thought there might be a breakable block. The scan pulse you just use when you want to know where all the breakable blocks are. There's also the flash shift, a little dodge move. The visual is very cool and it really adds a new dimension to combat. The new Phantom Cloak is really interesting. You go invisible and inaudible, and if it runs out of juice, it just starts eating into your health. That's a really great touch to add a bit of desperation, like you're hanging on for dear life. It doesn't see any use outside of evading EMMIs though, because those are the only things in the game you really need to avoid. Going back to what I said earlier about how power-ups let you interact with very specific things, there's a very small number of sensor lock doors that require going ghost to pass. It feels like a kind of desperate attempt to give the item any Metroidvania type function. This would have been a great opportunity to use memorable set pieces to increase variety. I would have thought it was really interesting if you were using the Phantom Cloak to like sneak past something, like a bear or a beehive or a bear and a beehive. Or what about a room where there's something that reacts when it sees you in a way that requires you to strategically use the invisibility to solve a puzzle? As it is, after you clear the last EMMI zone, you don't need to use the Phantom Cloak anymore. It's that simple. There is technically another power-up, but I'm going to keep that a secret. That's 21 power-ups, and only a small handful of them resulted in a change in the way I interacted with the game, while most just ended up like, cool, now the game will dump me in the spot where there's a block I can break with this. There's another thing that's worth commenting on. Hang on a sec. We'll get there. Yeah, there's a lot of loading in this game. I don't really care about load times personally, but man, Samus could get a diploma in that elevator. I also saw frame dips here and there if that's the kind of thing that bothers you. Granted, I did play on the regular ordinary Switch. I don't know how it runs on the Switch old. But let's talk aesthetics. The graphics are fine, they're serviceable. I don't get too caught up in game graphics. I've seen this game spoken about both as if it's like the most cutting edge graphical masterpiece and as if it's the ugliest game ever made, but it's like, it's fine, it looks fine, whatever. Samus's new design is appealing. I like the color palette. I like that even across upgrades she keeps the white color accent. It keeps up the idea that this is a new form, a new status quo for the character. The environmental visuals don't make me feel much. The background of the EMMI rooms sells the idea of a hostile alien environment, but otherwise I rarely had much sense of mood from the setting, with the exception of some interesting looking decor at the entrances and exits of levels. Unremarkable fire level, unremarkable water level. It came across as function over form. There's very little by way of environmental storytelling, and I didn't get any sense of purpose in the design. I didn't see any room to make inferences about what structures could be for. It's all just very video gamey. The motifs do little to distinguish them, but the names do less. Arteria, Berenia, Gavarin. To me, none of these names flag anything about the area. It's not even a spoiler to tell you a handful of the names, because what the hell does Ferenia mean to you? The names sound consistent, they sound similar to each other, so similar that I can only pick out the first two worlds and the last by name. Look at these three places from Metroid Prime. Which one seems most likely to be called Magmore Caverns, Talon Overworld, or Phendrana Drifts? Now, which of these places from Dread seems to be Arteria, Cataris, or Dyren? I'm so sorry, they're all Arteria. There's an assortment of portals which let you... hang on. Give it a sec. Which let you only travel back and forth within the color-coded pairs. It's not a fast travel system, well, it's not a fast anything, it's a series of context-sensitive shortcuts. I did not experience the game's world as something coherent. I know where I am, I know where I'm going, but nothing encouraged me to know where everything is, what everything is. And it's not that I didn't try, it's that there was no reward for trying. I couldn't see the point. Why bother remembering any details of the game world when the game world isn't going to meet me in the middle? I don't remember any of the game's music. I don't even remember the final boss theme, if I'm being honest. The only songs that stood out were the new arranges of other songs from the series. Okay, gameplay, visuals, sound. Let's talk plot. The back-of-the-box IMDb plot is that sometime after Metroid Fusion, the Galactic Federation gets a sketchy email with an MP4 file showing one of the dangerous X-parasites, which were supposed to have all been wiped out in Fusion, on the planet ZDR. The Federation sends 7 EMMIs to investigate, and they all disappear immediately. Samus goes to follow up and encounters the Chozo General guy from the unlockable art from Samus Returns, so that really was going somewhere? Anyway, Harvey Birdman jumps her and knocks her out, and she wakes up with a new suit and a bad hangover. This all happens before you get to, like, walk around. It immediately gives the impression of this game as a cinematic adventure where various characters will appear on the way. Also, after this series has gone to great pains to keep the Chozo mysterious and almost never shown directly, having one just kind of walk in is really amusing to me. The return of proper cutscenes is an interesting decision. This is the part where I'm going to talk about plot spoilers. In other words, things past the intro cutscene. I won't spoil the ending though. So whatever mysteries are established in the intro are kept up. Adam the computer chats with you about them while expositing minor details about the planet. Then the entire plot gets dumped on you in one cutscene, maybe a third of the way in. Another bird guy shows up and just tells you almost everything. Bird guy number 1 is named Ravenbeak. He led a military revolt with the intent of using the Metroids to rule the galaxy, whatever. A single X-parasite snuck into his faction and now there's a crisis. Ravenclaw knows that Samus has Metroid DNA, so he lured her here to get it. A couple hours into the campaign and 90% of the mystery is gone. Definitely a decision. Anyway, Birdman number 2 gets assassinated instantly, shocker. A little while later, Samus encounters the X-parasites and they multiply quickly and overtake the planet, which is really a way to upgrade most of the enemies in the game. This plot is pretty shallow, which is par for the course for a Metroid game, but it's also oddly generic, and wrapped in a discordantly cinematic dressing for how bare bones it is. There's a late game reveal about Ravenloft that is downright comical in how dull and trite it is. Like I said earlier, there's little by way of additional trappings to elevate the plot, very few details visible in gameplay that let you fill in any blanks, very few blanks at all anyway. There's a couple of little things like being able to see a boss's tentacles right before you actually fight it, but not much. We're left with a plot that plays out in 4 short bursts, and a game that's got little to do with that plot. If you want to talk about drawing lines though, throughout the game it becomes apparent that Samus is unlocking some new power, seemingly connected to her new suit. This is not reflected in gameplay. When I see a game that heavily emphasizes unlocking upgrades, an entry in the series that defined a whole genre about that, putting a huge emphasis on a new power acquired by the hero, and that power has nothing to do with gameplay, all I can think is, what a weird decision. I can see where it comes from plot-wise. It's the standard anime upgrade trope. The character unlocks or finds or is given upgrades and is thus able to overcome their newest challenge, but how strange to include a narrative about the protagonist strengthening and overcoming, having it play out in tandem with your in-game upgrades, and not letting those two things touch. As you collect all your upgrades, Adam keeps reminding you that you're not strong enough to defeat the bad guy, and at one point it says that even if Samus had all her upgrades, she still wouldn't be able to beat the bad guy. This new power is what convinces Adam that Samus might stand a chance. Again, no problem on a surface level, overcoming, surpassing your limits, whatever, but that upgrade comes irrespective of the player's accomplishments. Every item I found didn't matter to the plot. The power that just sort of happens to Samus is what matters. It makes me think, why am I even here? Without spoiling the final boss itself, I will say that you fight the boss and it's an exhilarating and exciting fight, possibly my new favorite boss in the series. Then after you defeat the boss in the gameplay, it overpowers and defeats Samus in a cutscene, only for her to then have her shonen moment and defeat it with her new power. It just reinforces to me that what I do doesn't matter. One more thing I'll say that's kind of an unspoiler. You know the Metroid staple of having different end screens based on things like playtime, completion rate, and difficulty setting, and how the general rule is the better you do, the less clothes Samus is in? It definitely, objectifies the character. I'm not gonna say what Dread's end screens are, but I will say that they have nothing to do with Samus showing skin, and that I find them way more gratifying than her stupid rubber bikini could ever hope to be. We are free of spoilers, that's about everything I can say of my experience. The game has amiibo functions, but God knows I don't have them. Nintendo's got some pretty serious issues with stock. Shame too, because this is a rare instance of a game I'd want to get the special edition of, and the Galaxy heard me think that, and it laughed. The topic I took from this game is lines. Lines and delineation and linearity. The line that separates the plot from the gameplay. The line that further splits the gameplay into exploration and action. The line between dread and guns blazing combat. The lines that highlight all the items of any importance. The lines that form the labyrinth of the game. There is traditionally a distinction between a labyrinth and a maze. Mazes have branching paths. Labyrinths are a single path. The path can wind and curve all at once, but it has one beginning and one end. There's nothing wrong with lines, any of the types of lines I described. Plenty of games make lines work, but a line at the end of the day is one-dimensional. A labyrinth can look satisfying, complex, confusing, but when you unravel it, what you have is a straight hallway. Metroid Dread felt like a labyrinth trying its hardest to be a maze. A labyrinth telling me it was a maze without showing it. It was a pleasing labyrinth, a roller coaster of a labyrinth even, but it wasn't a maze. Looking back at the rest of the series, I wonder if every game is a labyrinth disguised as a maze, and some just wear better disguises than others. But I liked Dread nonetheless. I really liked it even. I had a lot of fun, and I don't regret the purchase, but maybe that's the last line of Metroid Dread. The line between a game that makes me think, what a ridiculous story, what a perfunctory world, what a lazy layout, and a game that makes me think, what exciting combat, what exhilarating boss fights, what gripping stealth scenes. If you haven't played the game, there's very few things I recommend on a universal basis. Even if you're a Metroid fan, I can't tell you whether you'll like it. If you liked Fusion and Samus Returns, you'll probably like Dread. If you're invested in the purity of the series in terms of tone, aesthetic, and exploration, you might prefer to skip it. If you're not already into Metroid or Metroidvanias, this might be a good entry point to the genre for you, especially if you do like things like the recent Resident Evil games or reaction-heavy action games. To those that have played the game, did your experience align with mine? Some of the experiences I've described aren't inherently good or bad things, so if you did identify the same experiences, did you find them positive or negative? Was it an experience of dread, or an experience you dreaded?